As the 20th century unfolded, people in Appalachia heard whispers of change, of something called rural electrification. In rural America, especially the Appalachian Mountains, only 1 in 10 families had access to power. And why was that? Well, because power companies didn't think it was profitable. Stringing miles of lines across the mountains and the valleys, like, for the scattered families who lived there, the electric companies didn't think it was worth the cost. So if you lived in New York, you could flip a switch. If you lived in eastern Kentucky, you had to light a kerosene lamp. Then you had something that changed everything, and that was the Great Depression. The Depression hit, and millions were out of work. Coal prices collapsed. You had Appalachia, it was already struggling with poverty, and it was politicians and engineers telling mountain families, we are going to bring you electricity, power, progress, all of these things. We're going to modernize your towns, your farms, your homes. Dams were built out of the Tennessee rivers and their tributaries. You had hydroelectric plants churning out power, and the vision was very clear. Even the most remote areas of Appalachia were going to get electricity. So not everybody was convinced about this. There were power companies fighting the TVA very hard because they didn't want the government to step in and start regulating, electricity and be involved in that world. Some communities fought against it because they were afraid that electricity would cost too much, and that they couldn't afford it because that was like a luxury item at that time. But for a lot of families, the promise was irresistible. Imagine being told that your wife wouldn't have to scrub laundry by hand anymore, that you could read at night without hurting your eyes, that you could cook without hauling wood or coal to heat a stove. Like, electricity was sold not just as a convenience thing, it was sold as liberation from having to do this physical labor. In the 1930s, electricity was framed as the very definition of progress. When TVA workers came through, stringing up lines, digging foundations for dams, it was hope, it was change. Families sat and they watched and they waited and they watched these people put up these lines, and they waited for that moment that switch could be flipped on. Before we talk about the night the lights come on, we need to talk about what life was like in the dark. In Appalachia, for most families, electricity didn't arrive until the 1930s, 40s, and even 50s, even some later on. That means that generations grew up living in a world lit only by fire. Evenings were lit by kerosene lamps, candles, or the glow of the fireplace. The light was dim and smoky. Children strained their eyes doing their homework by candlelight and lantern. Women sewed or mended clothes with shadows dancing on the fabric. And when the wick burned low, the day ended whether you were ready or not. Cooking was done on wood stoves. You woke up early to split kindling. You carried coal or wood to the stove and you waited for it to heat. Meals were not fast. They were a process tied to firewood and daylight, and people at that time period were obsessed with keeping fires lit because they were a pain in the ass to make a brand new one if yours died. So it was an all-day thing. Laundry, it was an all-day chore. You had to haul water, you had to heat it up in big tubs, scrub clothes on a washboard. Every single task you did took longer, especially when the task was physical, and most tasks back then were physical. Without electricity, housework was relentless. It was never ending. It was hard. Nighttime was very quiet. You didn't have TVs or radios or lights. You didn't have the ability to have evening gatherings. Families would have to tell stories by fire, neighbors playing music on porches, communities coming together for revivals and square dances. When the sun went down, people went home. Life slowed down with it. You couldn't do a lot of things at night. So sociologists call this time discipline. Before electricity, Appalachian life followed rhythms of nature. Work started with sunrise, ended with sundown. People rested when it was dark, worked when it was light, and they lived in harmony with the seasons. But there was also danger. Kerosene lamps would tip over and cause fires. Open flames led to burns, sometimes fatal ones for children. Winters were long and dim, and the isolation of night, especially in remote areas, they were overwhelming. Imagine the contrast. You spend your entire life going to bed when it's dark, lighting one lamp in the corner of the room, and your whole world was contained in this circle of the glow of the light. Then, in one night, a switch flips, and your entire house is bathed in light brighter than the sun. That moment can't be understood without remembering what came before. Let's imagine the moment itself, the night that the lights came on for the very first time in Appalachia. For families in Appalachia, the first flip of the switch was unforgettable. Many oral histories describe it almost in sacred terms. People gathered in their living rooms, children pressed close to where light bulbs were, waiting as the linemen worked their way down the valley. And then suddenly, the house glowed. It was brighter than it had ever been before at night. Children shouted and they laughed. Some stayed up way past their bedtime just to sit under the bulb and look at it. And they saw it as like it was magic. Parents shook their heads in disbelief. One woman remembered turning her light on and off for hours just to make sure it was real. Think about how radical that was. Until that night, night was shadow. Night was lit by kerosene lamps. They gave a faint glow on the walls, but nothing like this. Nothing like an electric bulb. Suddenly, the whole room was filled with steady white light. Corners that had always been hidden were now clear and you could see them. Families saw their homes in ways that they'd never seen them before. It wasn't just light, it was a transformation. For women especially, electricity brought huge changes. Electric stoves, they replaced wood fires. Refrigerators replaced ice boxes and root cellars. People didn't have to preserve food as much as they used to. Washing machines replaced washboards and tubs. These weren't just appliances, they were hours and hours of labor lifted from the shoulders of women. Men too felt the change. Radios brought the wider world into the remote valleys. Baseball games, country music, the national news now played in mountain kitchens where that information never reached before. Farming equipment, shop tools, they became more efficient, powered not by muscle or mule or, they were running through wires. You had electricity. And the first lights brought so many complicated emotions. Some families, they worried about the bills. We're still worried about the bills. Electricity might be modern, but it wasn't free. And for people living close to the edge, each new bulb meant more costs to carry. But overall, the memories of that very first night, they're filled with awe. Imagine living your entire life without light bulbs, without refrigerators, without radios or washing machines, and then in one moment, you step into the modern world. Sociologists talk about collective memories, and that is shared experiences of entire communities remembering an event together. In Appalachia, the first time lights came on for people, it's part of that collective memory. Neighbors remember where they were, who was with them, and how it felt in that moment that darkness went away with the lighting of every light bulb. The night the lights came on, it's not just about electricity. It was about hope. It was about possibility. It was about watching the future arrive. Not in a newspaper or politician's speech, but in your very home with the flip of a switch.